So I'm going to give you an update on Phomopsis, rust, and briefly Downy Mildew. Phomopsis and rust probably being the ones of greater concern. We'll spend a little bit more time on them. And just Downy Mildew will be relatively quick. I want to make sure that you know that some of the information comes from Sabina Matthew, my counterpart at South Dakota State. And then I've had many good grad students working on sunflower diseases. So Brant, Ryan, and Michelle all have things to contribute in here. All right, so we're going to start with Phomopsis stem canker. So as I go through these three diseases, I'm going to start by reminding you all how they work, and then we'll get into the management update. So Phomopsis has become one of the most important, maybe the most important disease in North Dakota and the surrounding areas in the last decade. If you start with me here on the bottom, this is the disease cycle. It's important to realize that the pathogen overwinters. It can overwinter in debris, and it can overwinter on living hosts as well. Okay, so in the spring, you get some rain. These pathogen is going to release spores that's surviving on that residue or from neighboring fields or these other living hosts, and the infection will occur in the leaves, and that's something that's important to understand. So if you have rain and you have frequent rainstorms, you're going to get a lot of spores being released from that residue, and the leaves will get infected. From the leaves, then it's going to grow through the petiole into the stem, and then you'll see that stem lesion. And so you always see these stem lesions on a leaf. And then, of course, you're going to get wilting, lodging, yield will go down. But the reason I want to emphasize here that the infection starts on the leaves is because foliar fungicides on the leaves can sometimes help prevent this. So we're going to get into that in a little bit. But this is an example of an image of a Phomopsis stem canker lesion starting. And I will tell you straight up that I can't tell this is Phomopsis stem canker. I can't differentiate them visually. I do know this one is because we tagged it, but other things look like this. So it's not a good diagnostic tool to see Phomopsis, but you do get that infection in the leaf coming usually from the hydathodes and the leaf margins. Once you get that into the leaf, it'll go through the petiole and it'll cause this big brown lesion. And you'll always see these lesions surrounded where you have a leaf. It's coming through that petiole. Of course, if you got a lot of Phomopsis, this is it can be really damaging. And I apologize for the quality of the image, but it shows you how significant it can be when you have a really susceptible hybrid and the environment is favorable. Even if you don't lodge and you have some Phomopsis, you can still see some pretty significant yield loss. And this was an image taken by a colleague of mine in Nebraska. This is not from compensating, this is from Phomopsis damage. Okay, so some management updates. I think the first and most important thing about managing Phomopsis is going to be hybrid selection. There's a lot of information that the companies have. We've been having Phomopsis epidemics periodically for about a decade, and they're all taking notes on their genetics. And so while there might not be something that's totally resistant, there's not really a silver bullet out there, the companies do know what is going to survive better under Phomopsis disease pressure. So the first thing is I would always talk to the person you're working with for seed. So fungicides are similar. They're not a silver bullet, but we've done a lot of different trials. Want to share the results with you. One thing to keep in mind with fungicides is that as you get successive rainstorms kicking those spores up from the residue, you can have a lot of infection cycles. And so fungicides, they're not going to be a silver bullet either, but at some growth stages in some environments, they can help. And then just a reminder, don't forget about crop rotation and weed control. Some of the weeds we believe will host this pathogen. So Sabina Matthew, my colleague at NDSU, Bob Harbison, the colleague of mine in Nebraska, we've been working on trials for quite a few years, and I'm going to present a summary of 49 location years. So this would be 49 different fungicide trials over the course of 6 to 7 years. We've looked at strobilurian fungicides, the FRAC 11 QOIs. We've looked at the triazoles, these FRAC 3s. We've looked at some of the SDHIs, these FRAC 7s. The information I'm presenting is going to all take place at R1. So we've tried fungicide applications from the early vegetative stages all the way until probably full bloom, but this timing at R1 tends to be the most effective. Just a reminder, so this is V6. We've tried trials at this time, but at budding R1, it tends to be that we get the best control if we're going to get control. And of course, this is R5, but we're focusing here on R1. Throughout the trials they've all been ground application, which is of course a little different than in the real world. Natural disease pressure, we've tried confectionery, we've tried non-oils, we've tried what we would call susceptible and resistant, even though there's not quite that way. So there's a group of a whole bunch of different trials that we've worked on. So the first thing is that approximately 70% of the trials showed a disease reduction and yield increase when fungicides were applied. Okay, so that is good. There is some effect here at R1. Among the groups, the QOIs, so these would be the FRAC 11, so strobilurins, headline, quadris, and the like. They were the most effective, most consistently, and when you had multiple modes of action, that included the strobilurins. They had a significantly large effect compared to the non-treated control. The other ones were not as effective. We found in the course of the study that a single application of pyraclostrobin, so this is headline, or the pyraclostrobin is also the headline component in something like Priaxor at R1, could have a significantly reduced disease severity. We found that by about 37% over time. Part of the reason we isolated pyraclostrobin is we started a lot of the timing work with pyraclostrobin, so we tested that chemical more frequently than some of the other strobilurins. And it was easier to, of course, analyze and get a read on how effective it was. And then about a 5% yield increase or better was observed when we were using the fungicides. Okay, and again, this is all at R1. But 70% of the trial showed a disease reduction and yield increase, but that means 30% did not. As an example of what we've been doing, this occurred in Brookings 2019. This is one of the studies that Fabina Matthew did. And before I say anything else, not all these products are labeled. They're not all available, but we've been throwing the kitchen sink at Phomopsis. So some of these products are labeled in Europe. Some of them are on high value vegetables. So not everything here is available. But when we do see Phomopsis pop up, we can manage it to some degree with fungicides. So if you see the disease severity index here, okay, that's what the bar is. So the bigger the bar, more disease. You can see all these different active ingredients that we're testing. On the bottom is the non-treated control. So the bottom has a disease severity index of over 90%. And the best chemical, or the most effective in this particular study, this trial, included pyraclostrobin, the old headline compound, of course, found in Priaxor and other things, and some of the other strobilurins. Picoxy is in here a couple times as well. So there is a good reduction in disease severity if you apply at R1 and the environment's favorable over the course of the study. And this is an example of what a good trial with high pressure would look like. This is the same trial, except in this time we're presenting yield. And again, not all these products are labeled. On the bottom, you can see the non-treated control here. It's about 1,400 pounds an acre compared to the best chemicals, and they're a little over 2,000, maybe 2,200 pounds an acre. So even in this pressure, best case scenario, you're seeing a pretty good yield jump, but it's not a silver bullet. So there are products out there that work, and we have a lot of data on a lot of these. We do tend to see strobilurins perform the best, or strobilurins included in a compound perform the best. And we tend to see R1 as the most effective timing. But I will emphasize again that the more frequent rainstorms you've got, the more likely you're going to have multiple infection cycles, and you might see less of an effect. But we are making a little bit of progress with the fungicides, and I think that's good. This is from that trial in Brookings in 2019. This was the worst treatment was the non-treated, which we expect. The best treatment was headline, and this is the difference. Fabina took this photo for me. It's pretty stark when you get pressure and you got a fungicide on at the right time, and it does help protect the crop. Okay, switching over to rust. We remind you how rust works, and I'm concerned about rust, particularly in dry years. And we saw quite a few fields with some rust at the end of the season. And that's important because this pathogen will overwinter. Unlike the wheat rusts, which blow up from the south, sunflower rust will survive winter. And so I'm going to walk you through this here. The telia are these black structures that you see at the end of the season on the leaves or stem or whatever. They are tough. They survive that winter. In the spring, they're going to release these spores that you'll never see visually. And you can get early season infection. And it's orange. It's very different than what you see later in the season. So this is a picture I took. It was just a volunteer sunflower seedling in a wheat field, and it's full of these pycnia and these acia. This means the pathogen overwintered. And so we know we had some rust last year. We know it's possibly going to overwinter. If the conditions are right, you might see some of this early. And if you do, rust can show up early. But even if you don't get that, rust will show up in the middle of the season. And then this will continually cycle. So you get these cinnamon brown spores, and every 10 days or so, you'll have a new wave come in. All right, so the cinnamon brown spores that we talk about that are really important, they're dusty. This is a close-up of them. They're very small. You can wipe off the spores in your finger. They're pretty easy to identify. The only thing I really get them confused with periodically is like soil splashing. Rust is a little unique in what it needs to cause infection, and this is why I worry about it in dry years. This is an example. So I was in a sunflower field a couple of years ago. There was a sunflower leaf flat to the sky, horizontal to the ground, and it had a little depression in the middle of the leaf. And that depression, of course, would have a little bit more dew, a little bit longer wet period, and that was enough for an epidemic to occur in this little depression. And what rust needs is frequent leaf wetness. Heavy dews and fogs are ideal, and it needs warm temps, but it does not need rain. So sometimes when you see rust losses, and it doesn't matter what crop, it could be wheat or whatever, in a dry year, maybe not a super dry year, but in a dry year, you tend to see greater losses from rust than in a wet year. Another thing about rust that's important, it is specific to sunflower. Sunflower rust does not go to cereals and vice versa. So you're not going to catch rust on these other crops. But it is important to remember that they all have the same climate. They all like that heavy dew, that fog, that long leaf wetness. Here's another image. It shows up in the same way. You've got all these spores, these pustules showing up along the veins where you get a little bit longer dew periods. It's really common for rust. So you can get this in a dry year. And what will happen is it basically hemorrhages moisture and will dry up and curl. And in an epidemic, you'll have rust all over the bracts and the stems everywhere. You can see pretty devastating yield losses. Okay, so managing this, one thing that's important right off is to destroy volunteers and wilds. This will harbor the pathogen. I've seen fields where I would see some wilds that would pop up, or maybe just some volunteers along a roadside. I'd walk into the sunflower field and I would see rust right at the edge and getting less and less and less severe as I went to the center of the field. So it is important to get rid of these things. Hybrid selection is important. There are good resistance genes for rust. When I think about rust in sunflower, I really focus on confections. Confections are more sensitive than oils. You can see yield loss in oils, but really confections, you'll see a lot more yield loss if you get it early. And then fungicides can be excellent if you need it. Scouting is really important in rust. The timing is 1% severity at the top leaves at or before R5, and I'll show you what that looks like. And there's a lot of products to choose from. So if we're thinking about rust, the very first thing is get in the field and scout. If you see it early in the field, then you want to come back into the reproductive stages. And if you see 1% severity or more before full bloom, odds are it'll be financially in your best interest to put a fungicide on that field. And this is the upper 4 leaves, not the lower. So it's the upper 4 leaves at or before bloom. This is what that looks like in a leaf. So you've got about 1% severity here. It doesn't take much, and that's because rust is so explosive. So again, that action threshold, 1% severity on the upper 4 fully expanded leaves at or before bloom, R5, with an asterisk. So in the last couple of years of trials, and I'm going to show you some data from 2016 to 18 that one of my graduate students did, we didn't even get to that threshold, and we had yield loss in some of the convections. So this is a summary of 5 different confection sunflower hybrids, or sunflower trials combined, and it was all 5 confection hybrids. What you're looking at here in this trial, before you look at the data, all fungicide applications were made at R5.2. So they were all made roughly about the same time. You might put an insecticide in if you're thinking about that. They're all made in that early bloom stage. We put a bunch of different products in here, and they're organized by color, by their mode of action. So these green are triazoles, the blue are strobilurins, it's Frac 11, SDHIs are here, and then some combination products at the bottom, okay? All right, so we're looking at disease severity at R6. So we sprayed it, I would say maybe a couple weeks later or whatever. We've got some disease severity data. You'll notice that everything is below that 1% severity threshold that we would talk about, and it's at R6 already. So we were not expecting rust to do much just because of the growth stage. Well, we came back at R7 and rust had exploded on us. And it happened in more than one trial. Remember, this is the average of 5 different trials. And so how you read this, at R7, you've got more disease severity the bigger the bar. So disease severity is here. You've got a non-treated control with 6 to 7%. And then you've got pretty good rust management with a lot of these different products. The strobilurins are statistically better. The triazoles are statistically better. Even some of the other ones are better. A lot of products work. I would say the strobilurins and triazoles tend to be the best in what we've tried. One thing I want to point out too is that these 3 triazoles, they're all the same. They're all tebuconazole. We were asked to see if there was a difference among the generics tebuconazoles, and we did not see that. Other triazoles work well too. Okay, so what's that look like in yield? So we were able to get yield on 2 of these different trials and combined them. Remember, rust showed up kind of late, and the yields are really pretty good in all of them. The non-treated here is 2350, something like that. But that fungicide application really protected yield to the point where it was almost 2900 in the best, using the best products. So this was a bit new to us, and we've seen this again since, that we talk about that 1% severity threshold. That's really important, 1% severity at bloom, upper 4 leaves. But if you're going to err and you have confections, err on the side of spraying, because we saw yield loss show up late in these trials. Okay, last update. I'm going to make this one pretty quick with Downy Mildew. So Downy mildew is one of those diseases you really do not have in a drought year, but it's one of the ones you don't want to forget about. It's a pathogen that survives in the soil for many years. It needs it cool and wet after planting to really get going. And I'm sorry about this. When you see Downy mildew show up, you often see the systemic yellowing, chlorotic veins on the plants. They're usually stunted by the time you see it. Just make sure you flip those leaves up, and if you see the white fluffy growth, that's definitely Downy mildew. Now these are spores, and they'll splash around and they'll cause other infections, but it's really the early infection through the roots that we worry about. There's a close-up of those spores. Of course, when you get lots of Downy mildew, you have other problems too, a lot of plant death, a lot of weeds, things like that. Fully mature, those plants will be really stunted and the head will be horizontal to the sky. Okay, so hybrid selection is really important for Downy mildew. A lot of the companies have brought in different genetics for resistance. A lot of them are very good. Just remember the pathogen has races, so the pathogen could overcome those genetics and does at some point. But we've got some fungicide seed treatments available, and I just wanted to run you down with a quick update on what we saw over the last 5 to 8 years. Ryan Human, now Dr. Ryan Human, was a graduate student of mine who worked with this chemical oxythiopyprolin, which ended up becoming Planaris lumicina. It was fantastic. It was a fantastic chemical. Here you can see the non-treated in this blank spot, and all these are different rates of oxythiopyprolin, or in some cases, I think there's a competitor in here as well, or basically a positive control. Okay, so I'm going to show you one data table that I'm going to animate to give you an example of how these chemicals work over time. This bar, the vertical axis, is percent disease incidence, so how many of those plants are infected. So the bigger the bar, the more plants are infected. The smaller the bar, the fewer, so we want small bars. And then we have 4 different rates of what would become Flaneris and Lumicina. You've got Bion, you've got Dynasty, and then you've got the non-treated control here in purple. Okay, so the fungicide seed treatments for downy mildew are very effective, or can be very effective, in the first 2 to 3 weeks after planting, and that's the time the pathogen causes the most damage. So that's what we're looking for. Okay, so we rated this in the early vegetative stages. We saw all these different rates of Flaneris were excellent. Bion and Dynasty were definitely better than the non-treated. We came back a little bit later vegetative stages. We saw that seed treatment had prevented that initial infection in all cases. There's a little bit of increase later, but not much, nowhere near the non-treated control. And even getting into reproductive stages, we saw very, very little downy mildew. That seed treatment, it doesn't last the whole season, but it does prevent the most important infections early. And so it's very, very helpful. And there's lots of products that there's blends of these and things, and I would encourage you to use them. But the biggest thing is that we've got, with oxalipiperlin, Flaneris, Lumicina, we've got a really good tool in the toolbox, and Dynasty and Bion are still helping.